June 26, 1944. Hollandia Airbase, Dutch New Guinea. The checkers game sat unfinished as Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald looked up from the board. The man standing at his screen door had just introduced himself, but the name hadn't fully registered. MacDonald was focused on his game with Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, Satan's Angels operations officer. The civilian repeated his introduction with a quiet confidence that made MacDonald pause. Charles Lindbergh. The Charles Lindbergh, America's most famous aviator, was standing in a makeshift recreation hall thousands of miles from home, asking permission to discuss P-38 combat operations. What neither man knew in that moment was that this interruption would revolutionize long-range fighter operations in the Pacific theater. The techniques Lindbergh would teach over the next 6 weeks would extend the combat radius of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning by nearly 400 meters, transforming what pilots considered impossible into standard operating procedure. The story of how a civilian consultant doubled America's premier twin-engine fighter range is not merely a technical tale. It is a narrative of institutional resistance overcome by irrefutable evidence of pilots learning to trust mathematics over instinct, and of one man's specialized mastery of fuel efficiency, changing the course of aerial warfare in the Pacific. The mathematics of extended range were being written not in engineering manuals but in the daily experience of pilots who would learn that everything they had been taught about engine management was incomplete. The impossible was about to become routine, and the teacher was a 2-year-old civilian who hadn't flown a P-38 until 3 days earlier. The path to that screen door in Hollandia began 17 years earlier over the Atlantic Ocean. On May 20th through 21st, 1927, Charles Augustus Lindbergh had transformed aviation forever by flying 3,600 meters from New York to Paris alone in 3,312 hours. The Ryan NYP monoplane he flew, Spirit of Street Louis, carried 450 gallons of fuel in tanks so large they blocked forward vision. Lindbergh had navigated by periscope and dead reckoning, managing fuel consumption with a precision that would have seemed paranoid to other pilots of that era. He landed at Labour Field with 85 gallons remaining, having achieved fuel economy that experts had considered impossible for a Wright whirlwind radial engine. That meticulous attention to fuel management became Lindbergh's defining technical expertise. Throughout the 1,930 seconds, as he conducted survey flights for Pan American Airways across the Pacific and Atlantic, Lindbergh refined techniques that extended range far beyond manufacturer specifications. He understood that published range figures represented averages, not limits. Every engine had an optimal operating envelope where power output, fuel consumption, and mechanical stress reached perfect balance. Finding that envelope required understanding the relationship between manifold pressure, propeller RPM, mixture settings, and indicated airspeed in ways that went far beyond standard training. By 1944, Lindbergh had become one of the world's foremost experts on long-range flight, but his relationship with the United States military was complicated by his pre-war isolationism. He had argued passionately against American involvement in European conflicts, leading the America First Committee and earning him the enmity of President Franklin Roosevelt. On April 29, 1941, after Roosevelt publicly compared him to Civil War Confederate sympathizer Clement Vallandigham, Lindbergh resigned his Aurora Reserve Colonel's commission. When Pearl Harbor forced America into war, Lindbergh attempted to rejoin the Army IROR. Roosevelt personally ensured Lindbergh would not wear an American military uniform again during the war. But expertise finds a way. Unable to serve as a military officer, Lindbergh became a civilian technical consultant for aircraft manufacturers. He joined United Aircraft Corporation in 1943, working extensively with their Chance Volt division, producers of the F-4U Corsair. He spent time at Ford's Willow Run plant troubleshooting B-24 Liberator production problems. He flew dangerous high-altitude test flights in P-47 Thunderbolts for engine performance analysis. He helped develop dive-bombing techniques for the Corsair. His technical contributions were enormous, but Lindbergh hungered for combat. By early 1944, he saw an opportunity. United Aircraft wanted to study the feasibility of a new twin-engine fighter. The only American representative of that category was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Lindbergh convinced United Aircraft to send him to the Pacific Theater as a technical representative to observe P-38 operations under combat conditions. On April 3, 1944, Lindbergh prepared for deployment to the South Pacific. He visited Brooks Brothers in New York to purchase a naval officer's uniform without insignia. At Brentano's bookstore, he bought a small New Testament, writing in his journal that day, "Since I can only carry one book, and a very small one, that is my choice. It would not have been a decade ago, but the more I learn and the more I read, the less competition it has." He left San Diego on April 24th, officially bound for Marine Corps aviation bases in the South Pacific area around Guadalcanal. The trip was authorized by the Navy Department, but kept secret from the White House. Neither President Roosevelt nor even Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox knew Lindbergh was headed to the war zone. What began as an observation assignment became something more when Marine Corps aviation officers invited Lindbergh to fly as an observer on combat missions. On May 21, 1944, Lindbergh flew his first combat sortie, a strafing run with Marine Fighting Squadron 222 near the Japanese garrison at Rabaul. The Marines called it observation. Lindbergh flew with his guns hot, engaging targets. When opportunity presented, he quickly demonstrated practical expertise that went beyond theory. Working with Corsair pilots, he showed them how to safely take off with bomb loads double the F-4U's rated capacity. The Marines had been losing aircraft to overweight accidents. Lindbergh's careful analysis of power settings, takeoff speeds, and weight distribution reduced accidents while increasing strike capability. Word spread through the Pacific Theater that the famous aviator was flying combat missions as a civilian and solving operational problems that had stumped military pilots for months. By mid-June 1944, Lindbergh had grown interested in the P-38 Lightning. United Aircraft's interest in twin-engine fighters was genuine. But Lindbergh had also heard that the 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, was one of the hottest Lightning outfits in the Pacific. If he wanted to learn about the P-38, that was the place to go. On June 15, 1944, Lindbergh hitched a flight to Finchen, New Guinea. He announced his presence to 5th Air Force Headquarters at Nadsab, where Colonel Marion Cooper lunched with him. On Sunday evening, June 18th, Lindbergh dined with General Enos Whitehead discussing New Guinea developments and his plans to observe P-38 operations. The authorization was informal, unofficial, and insufficient by strict military standards. But in the fluid command structure of the Southwest Pacific Theater, personal connections and demonstrated competence often mattered more than paperwork. On June 20th, Lindbergh spent an hour and 20 minutes getting checked out in a P-38 with the 35th Squadron of the 8th Fighter Group. It was his first time in the distinctive twin-boom fighter. On June 26th, he flew to Hollandia and walked in on Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald's checkers game. MacDonald was 29 years old and already a 10-victory ace. He commanded the 475th Fighter Group, which had been activated in Australia on May 14, 1943, and had since become one of the highest-scoring P-38 units in the theatre. The group's 3 squadrons, the 431st, 432nd, and 433rd, flew the latest P-38J models with improved intercoolers and additional fuel capacity. These Lightnings were the longest-range fighters in the Pacific, capable of missions that no other aircraft could fly. But even with drop tanks, the P-38's operational radius was limited. Missions to distant targets left little fuel for combat maneuvering, and pilots frequently returned to base with uncomfortably low fuel reserves. Several aircraft had been lost when weather forced detours that exceeded fuel capacity. MacDonald initially dismissed Lindbergh politely, returning to his checkers game. But when Lindbergh explained that General Hutchinson, 3rd Air Task Force commander, had sent him to discuss P-38 combat operations, MacDonald paid attention. After brief conversation, MacDonald asked Lindbergh if he'd like to fly a mission the next day. Lindbergh agreed. The mission would launch at dawn. Rather than return to headquarters, MacDonald suggested Lindbergh stay at the 475th camp to eliminate transportation problems. As Lindbergh settled into the spare cot, word spread rapidly through the unit. Charles Lindbergh was flying with Satan's Angels. The reaction among pilots was mixed. Lieutenant John Perurdy of the 433rd Squadron looked forward to meeting the legendary aviator. Others were skeptical. Some questioned whether a 42-year-old civilian, famous or not, could handle modern combat. Major Thomas McGuire, already a 15-victory ace who would finish the war as America's second highest-scoring fighter pilot with 38 confirmed kills, wanted to see what the old guy could do. On the morning of June 27, 1944, Lindbergh prepared for his first P-38 combat mission. The weather was poor, rain falling steadily at 0530 hours. By 10:30, when the flight finally took off, conditions had improved. MacDonald led 4 aircraft toward Jeffman Island and Smart Airfield, regular targets for the 475th. Lindbergh flew as Blue 3 on McGuire's wing. The other aircraft was piloted by Merrill Smith, already an 8-victory ace. MacDonald watched Lindbergh slip into perfect formation on McGuire's wing. For someone who had checked out in the P-38 only days earlier, his formation flying was flawless. The mission involved strafing an enemy barge in Kibos's Bay. Lindbergh weaved through anti-aircraft fire, his cannon and machine guns raking the target. The mission was successful, and all 4 aircraft returned safely. But what the crew chiefs noticed after landing would prove more significant than any combat action. When the ground crew checked Lindbergh's P-38 after several missions, they discovered a pattern. His aircraft consistently returned with substantially more fuel remaining than other pilots flying identical missions. After a 6.5-hour armed reconnaissance mission on July 1 to enemy airstrips along Gilvink Bay's western shore, Lindbergh landed with 210 gallons of fuel remaining. Other pilots from the same mission returned with fuel gauges showing near-empty tanks. On July 3, the group escorted 16 B-25 bombers on a strike against Jeffman Island. After the attack, the Lightnings went barge hunting. Within an hour, 2 pilots reported dwindling fuel and broke off for home. Lindbergh continued the mission, his fuel gauges showing comfortable reserves. MacDonald noticed the discrepancy and called a meeting. 2 days after Lindbergh's arrival, the colonel gathered the 475th pilots in their recreation hall. The facility was crude, packed dirt floors beneath a palm-thatched roof, 1 ping-pong table, and some decks of cards completing the furnishings. Under glaring, unshaded light bulbs, MacDonald got to business. He introduced Lindbergh formally and asked him to explain how he consistently returned with more fuel than any other pilot in the group. What happened next would change P-38 operations throughout the Pacific Theater. Lindbergh stood before the assembled pilots and explained cruise control techniques he had worked out for the Lightning. The standard operating procedure taught to all P-38 pilots called for cruising at 2,200 to 2,400 revolutions per minute with mixture set to auto-rich. This setting provided good power and was considered safe for the engines, but it was also wasteful. Lindbergh explained that by reducing engine speed from the standard 2,200 revolutions per minute down to 1,600 revolutions per minute, setting the fuel mixture to auto-lean rather than auto-rich and slightly increasing manifold pressure to compensate for the lower RPM, pilots could dramatically reduce fuel consumption without losing effective cruise speed. The specific settings he recommended were 1,600 revolutions per minute at 30 inches of mercury manifold pressure, with mixture set to auto-lean and indicated airspeed of 185 miles per hour. These settings reduced fuel consumption to approximately 70 gall, achieving about 2.6 meters per gallon. Compared to standard cruise settings consuming significantly more fuel, the savings were enormous. Lindbergh predicted these techniques would stretch the Lightning's radius by 400 meters, enabling 9-hour missions. When he concluded his presentation half an hour later, the room fell silent. The pilots mulled over several uncomfortable thoughts. The notion of a 9-hour flight did not sit well with men who already found 7-hour missions punishing. The P-38 cockpit was cramped. Pilots sat on their parachutes with an emergency raft and oar beneath that. Their survival suits were uncomfortable. 7 hours in that cockpit was already pushing human endurance limits. 9 hours seemed inconceivable. More troubling was Lindbergh's recommendation to run engines at settings they had been specifically taught to avoid. The combination of low RPM and high manifold pressure was called running oversquare. Military flight training emphasized that oversquare operation would damage engines. The resulting detonation would cause cylinder heads to overheat, leading to catastrophic engine failure. Pilots were taught that if manifold pressure exceeded RPM by more than a few inches, they risked blowing up their engines. Now, this civilian was suggesting they should routinely operate their engines in a condition they had been warned was dangerous. The skepticism in the room was palpable. Several pilots exchanged glances. Some shook their heads. One pilot openly called Lindbergh's technique dangerous. But MacDonald understood something important. Lindbergh was not speaking from theory. He had flown combat missions using these settings. His P-38 had not suffered engine problems. His aircraft had returned repeatedly with fuel reserves that gave operational flexibility other pilots lacked. The colonel decided to put the technique to a practical test. If it worked, the 475th would have a decisive operational advantage. If it failed, they would know quickly enough. Over the next week, pilots began cautiously experimenting with Lindbergh's cruise settings. The initial flights were short, allowing pilots to return to base quickly if engines showed signs of distress. The first pilots to try the technique reported nervously that their engines sounded different at the lower RPM. The deep rumble of the Allison V 1000 710 engines changed character, but temperature gauges remained normal. Oil pressure stayed within acceptable ranges. Cylinder head temperatures, the critical indicator of detonation, actually ran cooler than at higher RPM settings. As confidence grew, pilots began using Lindbergh's techniques on longer missions. The fuel savings were undeniable. Missions that had required immediate return after target strikes could now include extended combat air patrol. Flights that had forced pilots to carefully monitor fuel consumption now ended with comfortable reserves. The P-38's effective combat radius, previously about 570 miles, extended to 700 miles, then 750 miles. Pilots discovered they could reach targets that had been considered beyond the Lightning's capability, fight for 15 minutes over the target area, and still return with a 1-hour fuel reserve. The transformation was revolutionary. The skepticism evaporated as mission after mission proved the technique's effectiveness. Lindbergh flew regularly with the 475th, accumulating combat hours and teaching by example. He led flights, demonstrating that the civilian observer could handle combat as well as any military pilot. On missions he led, his call sign was simple: Mr. Lindbergh. Lindbergh explained the physics behind the technique in ways that helped pilots understand why it worked. Aircraft engines produce power by burning fuel to create pressure that drives pistons. The amount of fuel burned per unit time determines fuel consumption. The goal is to maximize efficiency, producing the most power for the least fuel. Traditional high RPM cruise settings produced plenty of power, but wasted fuel because the engines cycled rapidly, burning fuel unnecessarily. By reducing RPM and increasing manifold pressure, the same power could be produced with fewer combustion cycles, each using fuel more efficiently. The lean mixture setting further improved efficiency by providing just enough fuel for complete combustion, eliminating the excess used in auto-rich mode for engine cooling at high power settings. The engines did not detonate because the power setting, though over square by ratio, was not actually high power operation. Manifold pressure of 30 inches was moderate, well below the 60 in war emergency power settings used for takeoff and combat. The lower RPM actually reduced mechanical stress on engine components. The technique was not dangerous. It was simply different from what pilots had been taught. Lindbergh's expertise came from years of experience with long-range flight. His 1,927 Atlantic crossing had taught him that published specifications were starting points, not limits. His work with Pan American Airways in the 1,930 seconds, surveying trans-Pacific and transatlantic routes, had given him thousands of hours to experiment with fuel management. The P-38 had an advantage that made experimentation less risky than it seemed. Twin engines. If one engine suffered damage from the experimental cruise technique, the other engine could bring the pilot home. Over the vast Pacific, where mechanical failure meant death by drowning or capture by the Japanese, most pilots in single-engine fighters flew conservatively. But the P-38's redundancy created a margin for safely exploring the envelope, and Lindbergh knew from the supply situation that the risk was acceptable. Allison was shipping spare V-1000, 710 engines and parts to the Pacific in generous quantities. If an engine needed replacement after experimental operation, ground crews could install a fresh power plant quickly. The operational advantage of extended range justified accepting a small risk of increased engine wear. The calculation proved correct. No P-38 engines failed due to Lindbergh's cruise techniques. By late July 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control techniques were spreading throughout 5th Air Force P-38 units. The 475th Fighter Group's success was impossible to ignore. Word spread to other squadrons. Pilots talked. Ground crews compared fuel consumption data. Other commanders wanted the same operational advantage Satan's Angels now enjoyed. Lindbergh gave additional presentations to pilots from other units. He explained the technique patiently, answering technical questions, addressing concerns about engine safety. The adoption was not immediate or universal, but it was steady. July 28, 1944, brought Lindbergh's most dramatic moment with the 475th. The mission was a bomber escort to the Seram area flying with the 433rd Squadron. Lindbergh flew as Blue 3 inches of 4, ship flight over El Puti Bay. Blue flight encountered enemy aircraft. 2 Mitsubishi Ki-51 sonars, Japanese light bombers used for reconnaissance and ground attack, were returning from searching for a missing comrade. The sonars belonged to the 73rd Independent Flying Chutai. One was piloted by the unit's commanding officer, Captain Saburo Shimada, the other by Sergeant Yokogi. The American fighters attacked. The sonars were outmatched, slower, less maneuverable, and lightly armed compared to the Lightnings. They should have been easy kills, but Shimada was an experienced pilot who had no intention of dying easily. The engagement turned into a running battle. P-38s from the 9th Fighter Squadron had found the Sonyas first and were already engaged when MacDonald's flight arrived. Shimada's wingman, Sergeant Yokogi, was hit by cannon fire from Lieutenant Wade Lewis. The Sonya's left wing caught fire. As the enemy aircraft straightened out to run, Lieutenant J.C. Haslip slipped behind and fired a long burst. The stricken Sonya trailed smoke and dove into the sea. Shimada's Sonya continued the fight. For 30 minutes, the Japanese captain outmaneuvered multiple attacking P-38s. He threw his aircraft into violent banks, wingtips streaming condensation as he racked the Sonya through maximum rate turns. P-38 pilots tried pulling lead on the target, but couldn't hold the aim point. The slower Japanese aircraft could turn inside, the faster American fighters. Captain Danforth Miller, MacDonald's wingman, managed to briefly get the Sonya in his gun sight, but lost track as Shimada completed a hard left turn. Miller's tracers fell 80 feet behind. Then Shimada did something unexpected. Rather than continuing evasive maneuvers, he turned directly toward the approaching Lindbergh. The two aircraft flew at each other head-on, at a closing speed of nearly 500 miles per hour. For Lindbergh, a man who had flown thousands of hours but never faced an enemy aircraft trying to kill him, the moment crystallized with terrible clarity. Shimada held his course. Whether attempting a ramming attack or simply hoping to exchange fire head-on, the Japanese captain committed to a collision course. Lindbergh instinctively kited on the Sonya's radial engine and pressed his trigger. The P-38's armament, one 20mm cannon and 450 caliber machine guns concentrated in the nose, erupted for 6 seconds. Lindbergh held the trigger down. Bullets and shells slammed into the front of the Sonya. The Mitsubishi's propeller visibly slowed. Smoke poured from the engine, but Shimada held his course. At the last moment, Lindbergh pulled up violently, his P-38 passing over the damaged Sonya with feet to spare. Shimada's aircraft went into a steep dive. Other P-38s fired additional bursts. The Sonya continued diving, trailing smoke until it hit the ocean at high speed. A fountain of white spray marked the impact. Foam spread in concentric circles on the water's surface. Then the waves merged back into the sea. The surface was as it had been before. Captain Saburo Shimada and his observer were dead. Back at base, the kill credit was discussed. Multiple pilots had hit the Sonya. MacDonald, Miller, and Lindbergh had all scored hits, but it was Lindbergh's head-on burst that had mortally wounded the aircraft, slowing the propeller and starting the fatal dive. Unofficially, the pilots agreed. Lindbergh had scored his first and only kill. The victory was not entered in the 475th's official war record. Lindbergh was a civilian. His participation in combat was already irregular. Recording an official kill would raise questions that might end his time with the unit. 3 days later, on August 1st, Lindbergh nearly died. The mission was a fighter sweep to the Palau Islands. The flight encountered Japanese Zeros. In the ensuing dogfight, Lindbergh found himself in a turning fight with a Zero pilot who very nearly shot him down. Only MacDonald's intervention, calling, "Break right," and then engaging the Zero himself, saved Lindbergh's life. The close call convinced 5th Air Force headquarters that enough was enough. Lindbergh had proven his techniques worked. He had flown approximately 50 combat missions across all his Pacific service, including about 25 P-38 missions with the 475. He had shot down an enemy aircraft. He had nearly been killed. It was time to return him to the United States before something went irreversibly wrong. On August 12, 1944, Lindbergh left Hollandia to return home. The pilots of the 475th Fighter Group gathered to see him off. Their respect for the civilian technical representative was genuine. He had not just taught them techniques that extended their combat radius. He had flown with them, fought with them, and proven himself in conditions where rank and fame meant nothing. The impact of Lindbergh's fuel efficiency techniques extended far beyond the 475th Fighter Group. By October 1944, P-38 units throughout the Pacific were using variations of his cruise control settings. The specific numbers varied slightly between units and conditions, but the principle was universal. Lower RPM, higher manifold pressure, leaner mixture, all combined to extend range dramatically. The operational implications were profound. Targets that had been unreachable became accessible. Japanese bases that had enjoyed immunity from fighter escorts now faced P-38s with enough fuel to fight over the target and return home safely. The extended range allowed fighters to escort bombers on missions that had previously been flown unescorted or not flown at all. Long-range fighter sweeps could penetrate deeper into Japanese held territory. The P-38 groups in Dutch New Guinea were soon flying 950 miles to targets, fighting for 15 minutes, and returning to base. Such missions had been impossible before Lindbergh's techniques became standard practice. The range extension was not trivial. In the second half of 1944, the increased combat radius enabled operations that directly supported MacArthur's advance toward the Philippines. Airfields that could not have been supported by existing fighter ranges became viable forward bases. Invasion plans that had required waiting for closer airfields could proceed more quickly. The strategic impact was measured not just in miles, but in time. Operations that would have taken months were completed in weeks because fighter cover could reach farther, faster. The technique also saved lives. Pilots who previously returned to base with fuel gauges showing empty now had reserves for emergencies. Bad weather that forced detours no longer meant certain loss of aircraft. Pilots who sustained damage in combat had better chances of reaching home. The fuel reserves provided a safety margin that directly reduced combat losses from non-combat causes. The extended range proved especially valuable during the liberation of the Philippines. When MacArthur's forces invaded Lae in October 1944, P-38s flying from bases in New Guinea and Morotai provided fighter cover over distances that had been impossible months earlier. The difference between reaching the target with no fuel reserves and reaching it with an hour of fuel meant the difference between providing effective cover and merely showing up. Yet the adoption of these techniques was not without controversy. Some commanders initially resisted, concerned about engine reliability. Some pilots remained skeptical, trusting their training more than a civilian's advice. Some maintenance officers worried about increased wear on engines. But the evidence was undeniable. Units using Lindbergh's techniques reported no increase in engine failures. Fuel consumption data showed dramatic improvements. Mission reports documented successful operations that had been impossible before. By late 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control technique was officially incorporated into P-38 operating procedures. What had begun as a civilian technical representative's observation had become standard doctrine. The U.S. Army Air Forces published updated cruise control charts for the P-38 that reflected Lindbergh's discoveries. Pilot training materials were revised to include proper lean of peak mixture operation. The broader story of Lindbergh's Pacific service reveals a man driven by complex motivations. His pre-war isolationism had made him a controversial figure. His comments about aviation technology in Nazi Germany had earned him accusations of Nazi sympathy. His public opposition to American entry into World War II had destroyed his relationship with President Roosevelt. When war came, Lindbergh found himself a pariah, despite being one of America's most accomplished aviators. But in the Pacific theater, far from Washington politics, Lindbergh found redemption through technical competence. The Marine and Army Air Force pilots who flew with him judged him not on political positions, but on flying skill and courage. Major Richard Bong, America's highest-scoring ace with 40 victories achieved while serving with V Fighter Command Headquarters and various units across the theater, told a United Press reporter that Lindbergh was as hot a pilot as any of us. He would have been out there knocking off Japs every day if General Kenny had let him. The assessment from someone of Bong's caliber meant more than any political rehabilitation could have provided. Lindbergh had proven himself where proof mattered most in combat. After returning to the United States in mid-August 1944, Lindbergh continued his technical contributions to the war effort. In October 1944, he participated in a joint Army-Navy conference on fighter aircraft performance at Naval Air Station Pooksant River, Maryland. He flew and evaluated captured Japanese aircraft, providing insights into enemy capabilities. He continued consulting for United Aircraft and other manufacturers, troubleshooting problems that arose in combat operations. The technical specifications of what Lindbergh accomplished reveal the magnitude of improvement. The P-38J Lightning had internal fuel capacity of 410 grams in standard tanks, 2 90-gallons mains, 2 60-gal reserves, and 2 55-gall leading-edge tanks with provisions for external drop tanks. Total capacity could exceed 1,000 grams at standard cruise settings of 2,200 revolutions per minute and auto-rich mixture. Fuel consumption varied by source, but was significantly higher than Lindbergh's method. Lindbergh's technique reduced consumption to approximately 70 gall per hour total. Combat radius increased from approximately 570 miles to 750 miles, with the same combat and reserve allowances, representing a 31% improvement. For missions requiring maximum range, additional drop tanks combined with cruise techniques achieved flights approaching 9 hours covering over 1,000 miles. These capabilities transformed Pacific operations. The strategic island-hopping campaign that characterized MacArthur's advance through New Guinea and into the Philippines relied on air superiority at each stage. Fighter range determined which islands could be bypassed and which required direct assault to provide airfields. By extending fighter range, Lindbergh's techniques allowed bolder operational planning. Islands that would have required costly amphibious assaults could be bypassed because fighters could reach targets from more distant bases. Some historians have incorrectly attributed Lindbergh's range extension techniques to the April 1943 mission that intercepted and shot down Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's transport aircraft. That mission, flown by P-38s from the 339th Fighter Squadron based at Guadalcanal, did push the Lightning's range limits, but Lindbergh had nothing to do with it. He did not arrive in the Pacific Theater until more than a year later. What Lindbergh contributed was making such extreme range missions routine rather than exceptional. The human element of Lindbergh's achievement deserves emphasis. He was 42 years old when he deployed to the Pacific, flying combat missions against pilots 20 years younger. The physical demands of hygiene maneuvering, the stress of combat, the discomfort of 7 to 10 hour flights in a cramped cockpit all took their toll. But Lindbergh never asked for special treatment. He flew the same missions, faced the same dangers, and followed the same procedures as the young lieutenants and captains who made up the bulk of the 475th. His willingness to prove his techniques through personal demonstration was crucial to their acceptance. If he had simply lectured about fuel management from the safety of headquarters, pilots would have dismissed him as another theorist who didn't understand combat realities. By flying missions and consistently proving his techniques worked, he earned credibility that no amount of rank or fame could have provided. The psychological impact of Lindbergh's success extended beyond fuel management. He demonstrated that civilian technical expertise had value in combat operations. Military organizations naturally privilege rank and combat experience, but complex modern warfare required technical sophistication that often resided outside the military chain of command. Lindbergh proved that civilians with specialized knowledge could contribute more.